Hi, everyone. We have a great episode planned this week for you about America's national parks and public lands, as many of you will be venturing outdoors this summer to see what nature has to offer. But before we get to the episode, I wanted to take a moment to weigh in on the Republican Megabill that Trump signed over the weekend, because it is cruel, senseless, and one of the most irresponsible pieces of legislation I've ever witnessed. I served 11 years in the Georgia House of Representatives. I know what it means to fight for people while under pressure from governors, from lobbyists and corporate donors, from your own colleagues. And I can tell you, this bill sells out average Americans to fund the powerful, the wealthy, and the mean-spirited. The more accurately described debt and deportation bill will add trillions to the cost of running our country by running down those who are the most vulnerable. Republicans in both chambers happily agreed to a bill that kicks nearly 17 million people off of their health insurance. It slashes Medicaid, adds red tape for patients, and guts funding that keeps rural hospitals open. It jeopardizes school meal access for more than 18 million kids, and if their parents can't find work, it boots children as young as 8 off of food assistance. Simply put, it cuts health care and food assistance for workers in order to cut taxes for the rich and finance a massive expansion of lawless behavior by ICE and Homeland Security. So what happens next? Once the Medicaid cuts go into effect, seniors in nursing homes will be told to leave. Children will lose access to life-saving care. Families won't be able to get help for mental health or addiction. Workers will lose health care, and states will shut down hospitals. Even those with private insurance and steady paychecks will pay higher prices for health care and wait even longer to get help if help ever comes. All of this to create a massive wealth transfer, the largest in our nation's history, making the gap between the have the most and the barely getting by even wider. This is not hyperbole. It's already happening in places that have tried these policies, and now Republicans are taking the pain nationwide. In the face of this cruelty, now is the moment for us to be doubling down on our commitment to caring for our communities. We'll be talking more about this in upcoming episodes of Assembly Required, but it's up to us to make sure our friends, family, and neighbors don't fall through the cracks. We deserve better, and we're not backing down. And with that, here's your episode. Welcome to Assembly Required with Stacey Abrams from Crooked Media. I'm your host, Stacey Abrams. National parks, once called America's best idea by novelist Wallace Stanger, have been a fixture of American culture and identity since the late 1800s. And as much as lore told us to expand, national parks reflected the instinct to protect and preserve, even when that ethos came at the expense of indigenous communities who'd stewarded the land long before there was an America. Any talk about, quote, public land has to reckon with the fact that much of it was stolen. Calling them public without that context erases a history of displacement and violence. But acknowledging this isn't a footnote. It's a necessary part of telling the full story of America, and it's a critical reminder of the debt we owe. Today, the national park system spans 85 million acres across all 50 states. These parks are not just sites of stunning natural beauty, they are ecological preserves and living archives of America's history, good, bad, ugly, and indifferent. According to a recent Pew survey, the National Park Service is the most approved of federal agency, ranking at 76%, an enviable ranking. And they are only growing in popularity, hosting a record 331 million visitors and contributing a record-breaking $55.6 billion to the U.S. economy in 2023. However, the parks are only a fraction of the public land that is stewarded by the government. Agencies like the National Forest Service and the Bureau of Land Management protect more than 500 million acres, or almost a third of our country's total land area. We're talking about wilderness areas, wildlife refuges, national historic sites like the Martin Luther King Jr. National Historic Park in my hometown of Atlanta, Georgia, and more. National public lands are one of the few spaces where your economic status is irrelevant to your ability to enjoy and wonder. My family, which my mom used to refer to as the genteel poor, we may not have been able to afford a Disney vacation, but we could trek through the national forest in southern Mississippi. I vividly remember the marvel of towering longleaf pines scraping impossibly blue skies, animal sounds that intrigued the ears, and my dad carrying my younger siblings that last quarter mile of the hike. Still, despite our public lands' massive popularity and the tourism dollars they bring to local economies, the Trump administration sees only dollar signs instead of stewardship. They prefer profit over preservation. And like most slash and burn moves championed by this version of Republicans, the historical genius of Republican President Teddy Roosevelt has fallen prey to a hurry to auction off America's legacy and its lands. Back in February, Republicans allowed the Dodge team to eviscerate the Park Service, including firing over 1,000 Park Service employees. Their abrupt, ill-considered move had an immediate impact. Half of the campgrounds in the Great Smoky Mountains were shuttered. Ranger-led tours were canceled, and workers were unable to do even basic things like buy toilet paper. Beyond visitor services, the Parks Agency is struggling to study the impacts of climate change, protect air and water quality, monitor ecosystem health, recover endangered species, and uphold treaty obligations to Native American tribes. And the carnage continues as Republicans in Congress debate making these draconian cuts permanent. The consequences stretch far beyond the impact on local communities, workers, and frustrated visitors. You see, the Park Service and other agencies that manage America's public lands are also on the front lines of responding to climate disasters, from floods to wildfires. And now the Megabill to finance the wealthiest Americans and corporations, which is currently moving through Congress as of today's taping, it proposes a catastrophic $1 billion in cuts, which would shutter 75% of our national park system. That's 3 of every 4 locations across the country. Versions of the bill also contain unprecedented language that would mandate the sale of public land, opening it up to development and drilling to help fund tax cuts for billionaires. Although its chief sponsor, Utah Senator Mike Lee, agreed to pull his language, there is nothing to stop this attack from returning in a different form, because the messenger isn't the point, it's the message. You see, the lands that Mike Lee and Republicans targeted include prime recreational, wildlife, historic, and cultural sites. Quick action by Republicans and Democrats on this issue demonstrate how bipartisan protection of our lands can and should exist. But that does not mean that our public lands are safe. The Trump administration has already indicated it will roll back other rules protecting remote areas of the country, including the provision to keep roads out of national forest. So, what happens now? What does all this mean for the future of public land? Who stands to gain and who loses the most? Today on Assembly Required, I'm joined by former United States Secretary of the Interior, Deb Haaland, who will walk us through the history of public lands as cultural and historical resources and the devastating effects these cuts could have. Then I'll talk to conservation activist and Outdoor Afro founder Rue Mapp, who will share how we can protect these lands and how we can fight to keep them public. Secretary Deb Haaland, thank you so much for joining me.
Happy to be here.
So I want to talk to you about national parks. Mm-hmm. Wallace Stanger once gave national parks the lovely description of being America's best idea. What's the history of the national park system and what makes it so uniquely American?
Of course. So, of course, you can't talk about national parks without talking about President Roosevelt, the first President Roosevelt, who was an avid outdoorsman. He famously camped out at Yosemite under the redwood trees with John Muir, and John Muir was able to convince him to protect those trees. Right? He cared deeply about the outdoors, that everybody that Americans should have this to rely on. And I mean, there's a lot of other history affiliated with the Antiquities Act, which gives a United States president the ability to designate a piece of public land. Some Indian tribes were kicked off of their lands in order to make room for national parks. So there's a long history there too. But overall, I think in 2025, people know them as a place they can go to recreate, to think, to restore themselves, to lay under the redwood trees, to just appreciate what we have in our country.
Well, we are having a moment where public lands and national parks are not simply a symbol of what we have in our country, and I think you are alluding to this. They are part of the civic infrastructure of democracy. You and I met during your tenure in Congress, and I got to celebrate your elevation to becoming Secretary of the Interior. And we're going to talk about how you're going to help continue to shape America's future later in the show. But I would love to have you talk about how you see our national parks and our public lands as emblematic of and also crucial to the civic infrastructure of democracy.
Of course, yes. Well, I mean, there's national parks in nearly every single state in the country. Out west, we have big national parks, right? Here in New Mexico, we have the Petroglyph Park. But basically, national parks are also emblematic of a thriving outdoor economy right now, right? Cities and towns, they sprang up because of these national parks. Hotels, restaurants, locally owned, gift shops and fly fishing shops and all of these places where people, entrepreneurs thought, I am going to start a business here. I'm going to be able to raise my family because of this national park. And so now we have this really long history of that national parks essentially go hand in hand with local economies. And it has really been a really good partnership for a really long time. And as we become more sophisticated as a country, right, we have biologists, ecologists, we have folks who study traffic patterns and design, parking lots in the best possible way to visitors. And we have timed entries in some places where folks won't have to wait in line. There's so much research and development that has happened as a result of these parks, just in order to make sure that you can take your family there and they will have an unforgettable experience like I did in my childhood.
Well, I was actually thinking about a story. I'm the second of 6 kids, and one summer, my mom and dad decided they were going to take us hiking in DeSoto, which was a park that was near where we lived in Mississippi. And I just remember us, hiking through the trees and looking at the streams. I also remember my dad having to carry the youngest 3 out because it was a lot longer than we thought. And my mom didn't realize just how long 5 miles was with 6 kids in tow. But it is one of my most cherished memories, just being in nature and looking at the sky and hearing the birds and being surrounded by these extraordinary trees that aren't what I would think about as part of Mississippi's heritage, but is so much a part of how I grew up understanding the land around me. And you just referenced it too, that you have this personal relationship to parks and how they helped you grow up. Can you talk a bit about that relationship and how that played a role into your approach to your work when you were Secretary of the Interior?
Absolutely. Well, it kind of started out in my grandfather's cornfield, Stacey. I used to go down to the cornfield. In the summers, we would spend time with my grandparents at their small village of Mesita on the Laguna Pueblo. And I'd go down to the cornfield with my grandfather, and he taught me all about the cycles, right? Why we have water in the irrigation ditch. It was from the snow that melted in the mountains and so forth. So I had an idea of why it was important, why our outdoors was important. My dad grew up on a farm in the Midwest, and he believed that kids belonged outside. He just felt like we needed to be outdoors at every possible moment. So he would take us on a he would take me and my siblings on a we'd rent a rowboat and row up and down Dismal Swamp for a few days. That's in Virginia when he was stationed there during the time he was in the Marine Corps. And when you're a kid, you're like, what about Disneyland, Dad? Right? we're in the swamp. My sister was, caught an eel, and we had our fishing poles out the side of the rowboat. But those memories have stayed with me all the way to the secretary's office, because I realized how important, when you're in the outdoors, time goes by really slow. And when you're a kid, those are the memories that will stay with you the longest. And so being out there, outside, on our lands, on our public lands, it made me realize that every child deserved to have the same experiences that I have had. And so what better way to honor the legacy of President Roosevelt, to honor the legacy of the Native people who were essentially removed from their lands to make room for that national park. We need to steward those lands in the right way and honor all of their memories.
And I appreciate you saying that. When you referenced going to Disneyland, what I remember about that hike with my parents, in retrospect, it was because they couldn't afford to take us to Disneyland. They couldn't afford to take us on spring vacation or to ski, but they could take us outside. They could take us to look at this extraordinary space that belonged to all of us. And you've called the national parks America's storyteller. And we know recently our parks have been under attack, especially for those of us who grew up in communities where the parks were the way we got to access, fun and adventure and the outdoors without being, able to pay what others could pay. And I know recently social media has been filled with these faux accounts that are purporting to be the voices of our national parks. They're very clever in the way they help reconnect us with this extraordinary resource. When you think about where we are as a country and the stories that we want our parks to be able to tell about this moment going forward, what stories should we be hearing from our parks?
We should be hearing first of all, about the Native Americans who used to live there, right? There's evidence of tribal histories all over our national park. I mentioned Petroglyph National Park. It's right here in Albuquerque, and it's a stone's throw away from downtown Albuquerque. So it's accessible to so many people in a city, right? You can just drive out 20 minutes to drive there. 15 or 20 minutes to drive, and you're in this amazing place, hiking on trails, seeing evidence of Native American cultures from thousands of years ago. And so that's what the interpreters, the folks, the rangers, the interpretive rangers who work in our national parks, they learn all of that history, and they're ready to impart that on anyone who asks. And so that's important. Also important is, history. Sometimes they name national parks after people. I worked on a national park unit named after Frances Perkins, our first woman secretary, labor secretary, who, thanks to her, we have protections for American workers. And so there's so much we can learn about our American history, about our cultural history, and all of those things. The cultural heritage, that's the responsibility of the Department of the Interior. That's in our mission statement, that we are required to protect our cultural heritage, and we do that for generations to come.
Assembly Required with Stacey Abrams is brought to you by Wild Alaskan Company. As someone who grew up on the Gulf of Mexico, my family loves seafood. And now that we live away from the coast, I still like to make sure that my parents have access to high-quality options at home. Luckily, we don't need to live near the water to get what they love, which is why I'm so glad I discovered Wild Alaskan Company. Wild Alaskan Company is a great way to get wild-caught, perfectly portioned, nutrient-dense seafood delivered directly to your door. My parents are excited when they see the box on their doorstep because they know good meals are on the menu. We are a family of enthusiastic cooks, and they like that they have different varieties of fish to inspire their recipes. The fish from Wild Alaskan Company is 100% wild caught, never farmed. This means there are no antibiotics, GMOs, or additives. Just clean, real fish that support healthy oceans and fishing communities. Wild Alaskan fish is frozen off the boat to lock in taste, texture, and nutrients like omega-3s. And it's sustainably sourced. Wild caught from Alaska, every order supports sustainable harvesting practices. And your membership delivers flexible shipments, expert tips, and truly feel-good seafood. Right now, Mom and Dad are enjoying the Pacific rockfish. If you're not completely satisfied with your first box, Wild Alaskan Company will give you a full refund. No questions asked, no risk, just high-quality seafood. Not all fish are the same. Get seafood you can trust. Go to wildalaskan.com/assembly for $35 off your first box of premium wild-caught seafood. That's wildalaskan.com/assembly for $35 off your first order. Thanks to Wild Alaskan Company for sponsoring this episode. Assembly Required with Stacey Abrams is brought to you by bookshop.org. Whether you are searching for an engrossing new YA series for your middle schooler, digging up a childhood favorite for a little one just learning to read, or finding a captivating novel for yourself that will help you unwind after a long day, bookshop.org has you covered. I just finished Amari and the Night Brothers by B.B. Alston, as I do my own research into the best young adult novels for tweens. I highly recommend it. When you purchase from bookshop.org, you are supporting more than 2,000 local independent bookstores across the country, ensuring they'll continue to foster culture, curiosity, and a love of reading for generations to come. And there's great news. Bookshop.org has launched an ebook app. You can now support local independent bookstores even when you read digitally. Use code Stacey to get 10% off your next order at bookshop.org. That's code Stacey, STACEY, at bookshop.org. So you mentioned Frances Perkins, who was the first woman to serve as a cabinet secretary, and you occupied a unique position in American history as the first Native American to serve as Secretary of the Interior. You were responsible for a quarter of all the land in the U.S., including national parks, wildlife refuges, national historic sites. And what I so marveled at during your tenure was that you focused on not just managing lands through acknowledging history, but through intentional repair. That you wanted to restore protections, you wanted to honor tribal sovereignty. You confronted history, including some of our nation's more shameful periods. And in that role, you really contrasted yourself with your predecessors and with your current successor. We know that in mid-May, the current Interior Secretary, Doug Burgum, issued an order that instructs bureaus to post signage that requests visitors to report, quote, any signs or other information that are negative about either past or living Americans. And as you said, this is about how we understand our history. Given that you've spent so much of your time devoted as a public servant to truth-telling, how do you react to what's happening to this whitewashing of American history?
It's a little ridiculous, right? I mean, history is history. This is the history. Our country stole children from their communities and sent them thousands of miles away to military-style boarding schools. Mm-hmm. They cut their hair, they beat them when they spoke their language, they tried to eradicate their culture from them. I am the manifestation of my grandparents having gone to boarding school, right? I mean, you can't eradicate me because I am part of that history, right? Generational trauma is a real thing. And all you have to do is look at those of us who have actually been oppressed, who have had the federal government policies impact our lives in negative, harmful, violent ways. And so I think that it's up to us, it's up to the folks who know this true history to keep speaking out and to make sure that we continue to tell the truth. Because, a sign is one thing, our voice is quite another. So we will just keep talking and speaking out and making sure that we are honoring the truth and honoring our ancestors in the best way possible. And of course, as governor of New Mexico, I intend to continue to defend the history of New Mexico and the history of our national parks. So I'm going to keep doing that.
Well, that is a perfect segue to my next question, which is that we know under the Trump administration, we've seen sweeping efforts to cut the budget and to shrink the Interior Department's programs that manage public lands. We have seen the impact that the cuts to park rangers and to our public parks are having on the economies around the country. And that there are governors, even Republican governors, who are balking, Republican senators who are saying, wait, this might be too much. We know the most recent budget proposes a 30% cut to the Park Service's operations and staffing. And the National Parks Conservation Association has calculated that the Trump administration's proposed cuts to the National Park Service could result in more than a 75% reduction in the national park system. As one of our nation's future governors, can you talk about what it would mean to essentially wipe out the budget and staffing for at least 350 national park units, including in New Mexico?
Yes, that would be disastrous because, as I said, local economies depend on national parks. Local economies grew up around national parks, right? I mentioned Carlsbad Caverns. Carlsbad Caverns is located near Carlsbad, New Mexico. It's a small town. It might be a 2 or 3 day trip that you infuse the economy, the small economy that really depends on visitors to stay open year round, right? And so it is really, it's shameful to think about all of those reductions when it looked to me that when they were firing people, they didn't even ask what their job titles were before they fired them. And quite frankly, there's a lot of folks in our national parks and our national wildlife refuges and on our public lands who make sure that trails are safe for people to walk on, right, that the bathrooms are clean, that we have the trash is emptied. And you have to empty trashes because sometimes there's bears who get into trash, and that becomes a safety issue as well. So I think that with respect to our states and the governors who run these states, governors will be the first line of defense against these really horrible cuts, against the awful ideas they have to slash and burn the National Park Service and our other public lands. It's just a really terrible idea. National parks were our best idea. What they're trying to do is the worst idea.
I know you're in New Mexico, but I want us to widen our gaze and look north to Alaska. We know the Trump administration says it wants to eliminate protections on vast swaths of the Alaskan wilderness, a move that will not only threaten species and accelerate the climate crisis, but will have a deleterious effect on a number of Native communities in Alaska who rely on that wilderness. And I think it highlights how the federal government's responsibility to protect public lands is not just about preserving our history or cultural inheritance. It's about acting responsibly during a time of climate crisis, and it's about recognizing and responding to our history of ignoring Native peoples and their needs. Can you talk a bit about why it matters to someone who lives in New Mexico or Mississippi or Georgia that we protect the Alaskan wilderness?
Oh, absolutely. Well, I mean, it's a balance, right? Our climate is out of whack because of climate change. I took many trips to Alaska, and the Indigenous people of Alaska, that's what they have. Many live a subsistence lifestyle. They depend on the salmon and other animals for sustenance. And when you destroy their habitats, when you say we're lifting all these protections, who cares if the caribou are migrating here or not? Well, that is going to have a really detrimental effect on thousands of people. So I would say to anyone out there listening to use your voice. I mean, Alaska Native people are incredibly strong. They have lived for thousands of years, sometimes on the tundra. They've lived on ice. They have they have, made use of all of the natural resources there. And sometimes it's a hard life that they live, but they love their land, and they deserve to have a voice. So I think that people, when we think about who's making these decisions, right, it's folks who have billions of dollars, who were infiltrating the ears of the White House, folks who can afford to buy anything they want. Well, these people, Indigenous people who've lived off the land for millions of years, they look at the earth as belonging to everyone, and they are ready to share it with each other. But when you have folks with that mindset that don't understand what community means and how important community is, it becomes just really untenable. So I hope that people are really speaking out. I'm going to speak out. I'll continue to speak out. And quite frankly, when I think about them destroying our national parks and public lands, they're destroying small towns who are the heartbeat of our public lands. They're also destroying people's lives because they won't have jobs. So if this is an administration that says they want to create jobs for people, they're not doing that.
I wanted to have you on today because as we watch what's happening with the Senate budget bill, with the rescission packages, with the Dodge cuts, every piece of this is about the real hurt that happens to people, but it's coming from a place of politics. And you served 2 terms as the chair of the New Mexico Democratic Party. You helped to shift New Mexico from the red column to the purple column and then to blue. And as we've discussed, a few months ago, I got to congratulate you on launching your campaign to become the next governor of New Mexico. But we're also watching our party grapple with this political moment. And you and I both know that much of the decision making has to start at the state level. So what's your advice to state party leaders who are trying to help guide their communities? We know protests are one tool, speaking out is a tool, but what are other ways we should be working to defend ourselves and our communities against the rise of authoritarianism?
Well, first of all, we need to win elections, clearly. And I know that a lot of states, they lost voters. It's up to us to go and make sure we get those voters back. How do we do that? We meet voters where they are. We have to go to the rural communities. We have to go to the mountain communities, the small towns across each of our states, and meet voters where they are, and help them to understand that we are, my candidacy wants to protect you into the future. I want to make sure that you have a roof over your head and your family can make ends meet. It wasn't that long ago that I, was raising my kid as a single mom. Soma's now 31, so has a job, thankfully, paying their own rent. But it wasn't that long ago where I couldn't buy groceries and pay rent in the same month. I know what it's like to be on food stamps. I know what it's like to sit in the waiting room of the Indian Health Service, the Indian hospital, and wait 3 or 4 hours just to see a doctor when I'm sick. These are things that I understand, and I am ready to make sure that folks across New Mexico know that I care about that. And so it's up to all of us to make sure that we are out there, that we are meeting voters where they are. We can't just sit in our offices in whatever city we're in and send out social media. We have to people need to see us in person. That's what I've done every time I've organized. I have a long organizing career behind me where I went to every rural community. I registered people to vote. I went back, got them to the polls. And so I'll say one quick thing, Stacey. I am grateful that people feel the same way. I've had over 10,000 volunteers sign up on my campaign website because they want the same thing I do. So anybody can sign up. It's debhaaland.com. I am ready to do the work that it takes to energize voters across my state and hopefully across other states too.
Well, future Governor Haaland, I've got one last question for you. You just gave us instructions on what political leaders should be doing for the people. What should the people be doing, young people, new voters? What should they be doing and saying right now, whether they're listening to this podcast because they care about national parks and public lands, or simply because they are afraid of what's happening? What's your call to action and how can they join in?
I mean, our call to action is if you have young people who are listening and they're already activated and they're ready to make sure that we have a change in leadership in this upcoming election, then they should be calling all of their friends. They should be, however you contact people these days, text message, social media, whatever it is, they can make sure that folks know how to do things. How do you register to vote? Let me show you. How do you get involved with a candidate that you believe in and that you want to win because you know that you share their values with them? I think young people, we're always clamoring about we need to get young people involved. And, my child, Selma, who I mentioned, has voted in every election since they were 18. I've been able to get Selma to volunteer on phone banks and things like that through the years. However they do it, and I know some things have changed, but some things really remain the same. At our foundation, at our root, it's contacting voters, it's having face-to-face conversations, it's making sure that people know that we care about them and that we care about the future.
Former Secretary of the Interior and future Governor of New Mexico, Deb Haaland, thank you so much for joining me here on Assembly Required. Ruth, thank you so much for joining us on Assembly Required.
Thank you so much for having me. It's an honor to be here in conversation with you.
So when we talk about the outdoors or national parks or public lands, there's often a very specific image that's conjured, and that's remote places in mountains or forests far away from where most of us live. Now, I have a core memory of trekking through the DeSoto National Forest in southern Mississippi, in part because it felt like this grand adventure, and yet for my parents, it was close enough to our home that we could go there instead of trying to go to Disney World. Can you talk about how you define the outdoors in this very inclusive way that lets folks who grow up like me have the same appreciation as those who see it as the sort of great outdoors?
Yes, thank you so much for sharing that beautiful memory. And for me, that is exactly what this work is about. It is about our heritage. And my parents came from the Jim Crow South. They knew about exclusion from public lands, those signs that said you can't come to this park, firsthand knowledge of lynchings. And so public lands haven't always represented a place of refuge. Unfortunately, they are also a part of our collective memory. And, you have the plaintive lyrics of Billie Holiday's Strange Fruit, blood on the leaves and blood on at the root. And so my parents, who migrated from the South during the Great Migration to California, they put together a family ranch up in Northern California. And it was truly that place of purpose for us, that place of gathering, that place of connection. And my dad was an outdoorsman. He hunted, he fished. And I didn't understand it then, but he wanted a place that we could connect with nature and one another and feel safety. But one of the things that you touched on that's so important is that our public lands are the pocket park in your urban area. I live, for many years in Oakland, California, and Lake Merritt is the oldest wildlife sanctuary in the country. And a lot of people don't know that. They don't know that they have important public lands right in their own backyard. So we're not talking about, always those remote places where no one ever goes. These are the places right in your own backyard. And the work of Outdoor Afro is all about helping people to reconnect, because we have a connection as Black people to the outdoors, just like you just described, like I described. And so our job is to help people reconnect to that heritage, to that memory, to that connection, wherever they are, and to see that connection close to home as related to those places farther away.
Well, you talked about the fact that you came to this from a space of family heritage, but I also love the fact that Outdoor Afro started as a blog, and that you've been able to weave together both this lived experience, but also this deep desire to share what you know and what you learn. I mean, I just learned about Lake Merritt. Can you talk about what inspired you to start writing about inclusion in nature and conservation? And I know you've given a bit of a backstory, but can you talk a bit about how what started you off has evolved and changed over the last decade?
Yeah, thank you for asking. So, I, always understood a connection to nature because of my parents, right? It was a normal part of our lives. We had wild game at the table. And as I got older and I started to participate in organizations, especially when I got further and further into wilderness areas, I didn't see a lot of people who looked like me. And also, when I looked at the glossy magazines of the day, I didn't see representation of a kind of heritage that I knew about, of Black people in nature as strong, beautiful, and free. And I also knew that Black people have had, in the darkest of times, we've had a connection that we fostered in places of purpose, like Martha's Vineyard or Lincoln Hills, Lake Ivanhoe, Chicken Bone Beach. I mean, you name it. We, like my dad, have always prioritized being connected to nature as a place to find our safety, our rest from the pressing, pressures and terror of racism. And so I didn't hear those stories. I didn't see those stories. And I wanted to tell a new narrative. I wanted to show Black people in our history, but also to offer an invitation to help people find their connection today, even if it'd been interrupted, in recent years or through, moving to a city. So Outdoor Afro just was a blog on my heart to tell these stories about my family, about all this rich Black history and nature. And people, this is like 2009, so social media was brand new. And there were no algorithms, hashtags. It was very simple. And I was able to, from my kitchen table, to have this joyous conversation and get a momentum going that turned into an organization. And today, Outdoor Afro is a national not-for-profit organization that is here still celebrating and inspiring Black connections and leadership in nature. We're in 30 states. And we're in 70 markets, and we train a cohort of volunteers to help people get reconnected to their nature places close to home and far away, hiking, biking, camping, you name it, we're doing it. So it's really been a joy to be a part of this work, and also for me to be able to link arms as a leader with other prominent and influential nonprofit conservation organizations to, just help people understand that Black people, we care about laws to protect the environment. And it is through building that relationship that we have, our voice being able to be heard and expressed at the table to advocate for the protection of public lands.
Assembly Required is brought to you by Mosh. The old adage, you are what you eat, makes sense to me, now more than ever. And what you eat as you age matters a lot. So I'm always on the hunt for a satisfying snack that won't make me regret my choices in the morning. One of my go-tos these days is Mosh Bars. Mosh was founded by Maria Shriver and her son, Patrick Schwarzenegger, with a simple mission: to create a conversation about brain health through food, education, and research. So, Mosh joined forces with the world's top scientist and functional nutritionist to go beyond your average protein bar. With 8 delicious flavors, including peanut butter and chocolate, and my new favorite, cookie dough, each Mosh bar is made with ingredients that support brain health like ashwagandha, lion's mane, collagen, and omega-3s. And now, Mosh bars come with a great look and new formulation featuring a game-changing, brain-boosting ingredient you won't find in any other bar. Mosh is now the first and only food brand boosted with Cognizin, a premium nootropic that supplies the brain with a patented form of acetylcholine. Maria's father suffered from Alzheimer's, and since then, she and Patrick have dedicated themselves to finding ways to help other families dealing with this debilitating disease. We lost our great-grandmother to Alzheimer's years ago, and while resources have improved, we still have a ways to go. One of the reasons I'm proud to eat Mosh is that it donates a portion of all proceeds from your orders and mine to fund gender-based brain health research through the Women's Alzheimer's Movement. Mosh is working closely to close the gap between women and men's health research, a mission I strongly support. Maintaining a brain-healthy diet while also delivering assembly required and my other projects takes planning. Whether I'm headed to a podcast taping or rushing to the airport, having a Mosh bar in my go bag is one less decision I need to make. If you want to find ways to support crucial brain health research while you fuel your body and your brain, Mosh bars are a great way to do both. Head to moshlife.com/assembly to save 20% off plus free shipping on the bestsellers trial pack. That's 20% off plus free shipping on the bestsellers trial pack at moshlife.com/assembly. And thank you, Mosh, for sponsoring this episode. So I grew up in Gulfport, Mississippi, which is one of the urban areas of the state of Mississippi. But I remember so vividly, not only when my parents took us to hike in DeSoto National Forest, I remember when we went to Camp Itakana and we spent the weekend fishing and hiking. I got to teach horseback riding at that camp and grew up not necessarily thinking of myself as an outdoors person, but going with my dad and my great-grandmother to go fishing. Part of the work that I see you doing as we talk about public lands and access to the outdoors is very much DEI work. I spend a lot of time these days talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion, and that's often relegated to a corporate conversation or a hiring conversation, a really boring HR seminar. But what you've just described is the essence of how DEI lives in our public lands. Can you talk a bit about how you see this as not only a cultural issue, but a political issue and an access issue?
Yeah. Such a great question. And Stacey, one of the things that really strikes me when we talk about these efforts, especially the efforts now to, sell public lands, and, we just dodged one at the moment of this recording for, millions of acres taken out of the reconciliation bill. And a lot of people didn't even know that it was there. And I just, thank my lucky stars for organizations like the Wilderness Society that got the maps out there so that people could see, because maps are powerful. Like you put a map in front of people, you're telling a story. People are able to locate themselves, their favorite places, possibly being for sale, right? But as it relates to the Black community, what really strikes me about this moment is how it definitely awakens a generational memory of Black land loss in our country. So many of our ancestors worked hard to own land, to steward land, and far too often that land was stripped away through violence, legal manipulation, and economic exclusion. And, public lands right now represent to me the last forms of land that we all have a stake in. And it may not be owned in the traditional sense, like private property, but it's a part of our collective inheritance. And it is the land that our communities should have access to and be able to enjoy and of course to find economic opportunity. That's one of the things that a lot of people don't know. It's like, we're talking about $1 trillion economy that's associated with these public lands. We're talking about outfitters, we're talking about gateway communities, we're talking about, those quaint B&Bs that sit in those gateway communities. So this is also not just about access, but there's also an opportunity to be at the table for the economic benefits. So like when I see this pattern of land being pulled away from public hands and handed over possibly to private interest for, Lord knows what, it rings a very familiar bell for the Black community. And, and we've been here before. And so I'm very, very much an advocate that we should underscore the importance of helping helping our communities to see that it's not just about forests, as you said before. It's not about like someplace in the yonder that nobody, will ever visit, but it is about fairness. It is about access, and it is about whether or not our next generation will have a share in accessing this land and the promise that it represents, right?
Well, I appreciate the way you approach this. We're also having a conversation with Secretary Deb Haaland, who really speaks to the history in this country. What happened to Indigenous people, what became public land was stolen land. And as you pointed out, land loss has often attended the conversations about what society looks like. There's what was done to African Americans. There's also the fact that if you look at anti-immigrant legislation in this country, it began with stripping Chinese Americans of their right to own property, of stripping Hispanic Americans of their right to own property as a precursor to the other oppressions that were visited. But at the same time, the expansion of public land conservation created space for these same communities to find themselves still in community with one another. And I know that you sit on the boards of the Wilderness Society and the Theodore Roosevelt Conservation Partnership. Can you talk a little bit more about why these public lands are not only worth fighting for, but what it means for you to be at the table in these conversations at a time of unprecedented attack?
Yeah, I mean, it's truly an honor for me to be able, I've been on the board for the Wilderness Society now for about 7 years. I was previously vice chair and now I'm co-chair. And then I'm also, as you mentioned, on the Theodore Roosevelt Conservation Partnership. And these are two prominent organizations that work in a bipartisan way to, protect our wilderness areas, our national forests, our farmlands, our working lands. And what I really appreciate is how each in their bipartisan ways are able to bring together so many different groups together. So everyone from the hiker to the farmer to the fisher to the hunter. And by the way, I hunt and fish. So that also is a very personal connection. And I have a personal mission to help us reconnect with those skills too, because I'm like, listen, people, if your local grocery store shuts down, how are you going to get your protein? Okay, so it is so personal to me to be able to be connected to two organizations that absolutely represent my values, but also a way that they are at the table, and I, by extension, am allowed to, be a part of this conversation to infuse the Black perspective, the Black American perspective into these conversations. And these organizations are not new. The Wilderness Society has been around at the front line of these fights since 1935, and they have done an amazing job. But it's the way that they are able to just doggedly be advocating, but also telling the story, and not just protecting, but also making sure that Native American sovereignty and stewardship are elevated in this conversation, alongside access for all Americans. And, right now, this moment is not just about budget cuts. It's about values.
So, Rue, as you mentioned, the Senate recently withdrew a new plan to sell off millions of acres of public land across 11 states as part of their Megabill. Now, thankfully, this was tabled due to fierce opposition from bipartisan senators, especially Republican senators in Western states, aided by the work done by the Wilderness Society. But are we out of, no pun intended, are we out of the woods yet?
Well, it's not over.
Exactly.
It's not over, and we have to stay vigilant. And we can look forward. I mean, I'm telling everybody, get hydrated and eat your protein, because we have 3.5 more years of this, and these threats are going to keep coming back. And one of the things I want to always highlight is this moment of opportunity that's so important to recognize and celebrate, that public lands have brought together unlikely co-conspirators, right? We have, our urban nature enthusiasts right alongside the rural rancher, the angler, the hunter. It's really brought together in a bipartisan way people who are able to tell their story for why public lands are important. And so I want to encourage everyone to recognize, this is not the time to go to sleep or to over celebrate, but to keep that momentum going. And I'm just really thankful that there's organizations like, of course, Outdoor Afro, but the Wilderness Society and TRCP that are going to stay vigilant, and they will continue to monitor the, further rollbacks, such as, conservation laws like the Great American Outdoors Act, the Farm Bill, and we're prepared to mobilize again and again and to keep public pressure high. But I also want to offer something to people who might be feeling overwhelmed, and and how people might, even be discouraged in this moment, because it is overwhelming. It seems like, we're talking about faraway places and people deciding the fate of those places in a faraway DC for most Americans. But I really want people to build that relationship and strengthen that relationship with their local nature. It doesn't have to be going, to a big wilderness area. Start small, go for a walk in your local park or sit under a tree. Nature is just so patient. And, back to what you were talking about when you talk about our justice, right? For me, connecting with nature is an important part of the equation to express both our joy and our justice. I know when I go out in nature, the trees don't know that I'm Black. The flowers are still going to bloom no matter how much money is in my account. Okay. The birds are going to sing no matter who I voted for. So I feel like nature is the template for what equality actually is and can be expressed, and what we can learn from it. So I'm just really thankful to be able to do this work that gives us some breathing room, but as well, powerful role model for how we can be.
That is an extraordinary way to frame this. And as you describe how nature can nurture us in this work, my last question to you, because we love to do this on Assembly Required, is give people a call to action. What can our listeners, our viewers do to join the fight to protect our public lands?
Well, I always like to say, I'm a lover, not a fighter. But I do believe that joy is action, right? Alongside speaking up, right? So I want everybody to call your senator, share your story, share your why. Of course, as I mentioned before, support the organizations that are on the front line of defending the policies. But Outdoor Afro is here for you to help you strengthen your relationship so that you have a story to tell about why these public lands matter for you. And one of the things that we're doing, very practically, is helping Black children learn how to swim. And we're also including their caregivers, because our history of Jim Crow, have given us a terrifying and troubling inheritance of Black children who are drowning at 5 to 7 times the rate of their white counterparts. And we know that if a child doesn't know how to swim, they're not going to ease into a tippy kayak. They're not going to put a pole in a lazy lake, and they're not going to care about plastic in the ocean. So in addition to saving lives, our planet needs people to be in relationship with water. And so my invitation is not only, get involved with your local representative, but also strengthen your relationship in a safe and sustainable way with the outdoors. And that's why Outdoor Afro is here. And so we have an app where you can apply for what we call swimmerships. And you don't even have to be a kid. Okay, there's a lot of grown folks running around here who don't know how to swim. So we are giving swim scholarships to mom and dad and grandma and grandpa. So my call to action is to learn how to swim and get in good relationship with the outdoors, because all together, with our story, with our joy, okay, our empowered joy in nature, we will be able to link arms with everyone to move the needle forward to protecting our precious wild all around.
Rue Mapp, thank you so much for joining me today on Assembly Required.
Thank you so much for having me.
As always on Assembly Required, we're here to give you real, actionable tools to face today's biggest challenges. First, be curious. No matter where you live, you're probably near a place that is part of our network of public lands. So get curious about what's in your neighborhood and look beyond just the national parks. There are national historic sites, national forests, wildlife refuges, and national monuments that are all managed by our federal government in trust for the public. There are city, state, and tribally managed lands too. Rue mentioned a few of those. So go visit these places and inform yourself about their history. There are city, state, and tribally managed lands too. Rue mentioned a few of them. So go visit these places and inform yourself about their history. And stay up to date with local news to make certain that you know what's happening with public lands near you. Number 2, solving problems. Our local, state, and national representatives are always making decisions about our public spaces, from deciding if there are swimming pools in our neighborhoods to deciding whether we're going to tell the story and the history about tribal public lands. There are often open rounds of public comment when changes are being made to public spaces. So make sure you make your voice heard and let local leaders know what you think. There is a bipartisan concern about cuts to the National Park Service. So call your members of Congress, Democrats and Republicans, to let them know what you think of this administration gutting the National Park Service and other land bureaus. Make certain you mention what you've heard and what you're afraid of. And in the coming months, as Congress works to pass a budget, they will be considering even further cuts, like rolling back protections for parks and public lands, reducing the budgets of the agencies managing them, and selling off public land to private developers. So contact your representatives, state, local, and federal, and let them know you want to see these places conserved, not exploited. And lastly, but always, do good. Donate to organizations doing the work to advocate for the protection of our parks and public lands, and who tell an inclusive story about who the public lands are for. You can donate to the Wilderness Society at act.wilderness.org and the National Parks Conservation Association at support.npca.org. Organizations like these advocate for strong environmental policies, fight legal battles to stop destructive development, and work to ensure public lands stay public. And you can also support Rue Mapp's work connecting marginalized people with the natural spaces in this time of political upheaval. So find Outdoor Afro at outdoorafro.org/donate. Now here at Assembly Required, we are always reaching out to a broader audience that wants to dive a bit deeper into the headlines and to find ways to make a difference. But we need your help to reach them. If you like what you hear, be sure to share this episode and subscribe on all of your favorite platforms. And to meet the demands of the algorithms, please rate the show and leave a comment. You can find us on YouTube, Spotify, Apple, or wherever you go to listen and learn. Speaking of which, we are preparing an entire episode of listener questions. So if you have a question for me, send it in. You can start with an email to assemblyrequired@crooked.com or leave us a voicemail, and you and your questions and comments might be featured on the pod. Our number is 213-293-9509. That wraps up this episode of Assembly Required with Stacey Abrams. Be careful out there, and I'll meet you here next week.